The alert came without warning. Not a distress signal, not a diplomatic request, not even the usual pre-arrival identification burst that every civilized species in the galaxy had agreed to send at least 6 hours before entering neutral space. Nothing. One moment the long-range sensors showed empty space at coordinate Sector 11, a dead patch of nothing between the Velhari shipping lanes and the outer edge of Galactic Assembly jurisdiction. The next moment, something was there. I was standing at my assigned station on Level 7 of the Assembly Observation Platform when the senior sensor officer, a Thovani named Quell, made a sound I had never heard a Thovani make before. It was somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. I had worked alongside Quell for 3 standard years, and in that time I had seen him report collapsing stars, territorial incursions, and 2 separate plague events without once raising his voice above a professional monotone. So when he made that sound, every being in the room turned to look at him. He was staring at his console screen. His 4 upper fingers were absolutely still, which for a Thovani meant his entire nervous system had just locked up from shock. I crossed the room without being told to. My name is Vane, Junior Diplomatic Attaché, 3rd rank, assigned to the Galactic Assembly Station on a 2-year rotation from the Sulhari Cooperative. I was 26 standard years old. I had never seen a battle, and I was about to watch the most stable political structure in the known galaxy begin to come apart at the edges, right there in front of me, in the space of a single afternoon. The reading on Quell's screen did not make sense to me at first. The mass figure had to be a sensor error. I actually looked over my shoulder to see if someone was running a system calibration test, because the number displayed was the kind of number that belonged to a small moon, not a vessel. But the other readings all confirmed each other. Drive signature, active, stable, unknown configuration. Hull dimensions, longer than the assembly station itself, and the station was home to 4,000 beings. Power output. The screen had simply stopped trying to calculate it and was displaying a symbol I had never seen before, which I later learned was the sensor system's way of saying the number exceeded its measurement range. Quell finally spoke. His voice was very quiet. He said the words every being in that room had already started thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. Sol System, he read from the screen. Terran Coalition. Vessel designation, TC Dreadnought 7. The room did not explode into noise. That surprised me then, though it makes perfect sense now. When something is too large to immediately understand, the mind goes quiet first. Everyone in that observation room simply stood very still and looked at the screen, and the screen showed a shape moving through space at the outer edge of our sensor range, and the shape was enormous, and it was moving toward us. I had heard of the Terran Coalition. Every species with access to galactic records had heard of the Terran Coalition. The way you hear about a story that has been passed between travelers for generations until nobody is entirely sure which parts are true. Humanity had been on the galactic record for roughly 80 standard years, ever since a Velhari survey vessel had detected radio signals coming from the 3rd planet of a single yellow star near the outer arm of the galaxy. Protocol required observation. Protocol required non-interference. Protocol required patience. What Protocol had not anticipated was that the species being observed would, within 60 standard years, go completely silent on the radio frequencies, rebuild their entire civilization around energy systems the survey probes could not even fully scan, and then simply stop being detectable at all. Most of the Assembly's scientific community had quietly concluded that humanity had done what a number of young species did, reached a development peak and then collapsed, either from internal pressures or from one of the 1,000 natural disasters that could erase a civilization before it ever reached the stars. The sensor reading on Quell's screen was a very definitive argument against that conclusion. The first message came 14 minutes after initial detection. It was short, transmitted on a standard assembly frequency, written in perfect unified galactic script, and so politely worded that it took me 2 full readings to process the confidence hidden inside the courtesy. It said, Terran Coalition Vessel 7 to Galactic Assembly Station, Sector 11 approach, requesting docking clearance for standard diplomatic contact. Single envoy, no escort. Estimated arrival at station perimeter, 4 hours. Please advise preferred bay assignment. Thank you. Thank you. They said thank you. Director Orath, the Assembly's head of station operations, a Cathali who had been managing diplomatic crises for longer than most species at the station had been spacefaring, read that message 3 times. Then she called an emergency session of every department head, every senior diplomat, and every security officer on the station. She did not call me, because I was 3rd rank and not entitled to the session. But she also did not tell me to leave the observation platform, because she had already forgotten I was there, which meant I stood at that sensor console with Quell for the next 4 hours and watched everything. The vessel did not accelerate. It did not change course. It did not broadcast anything else. It simply moved through space at a steady, unhurried pace, and it grew on the long-range sensors the way a storm grows on a weather display, gradually, and then all at once. And then you realize the numbers you were reading were not exaggerations. Quell ran the sensor sweep 17 times. I counted. Each sweep came back with the same answer. The thing approaching us was not a warship in the way we used that word, the way we meant a vessel designed primarily for speed and targeted offensive capability. It was something older than that concept. It was a vessel built to absorb everything the universe could throw at it and keep moving. The hull plating read as a composite material our database had no entry for. The weapon arrays, and there were many of them, were powered down, which our sensors could confirm, but they were present in numbers that made several of the senior staff go very quiet when they saw the inventory list. By the time the vessel slowed to approach speed at our perimeter, the emergency session had been running for 3 hours, and had produced no consensus on what to do. The message had said single envoy, no escort. It had said docking bay assignment, as if this were a routine supply delivery. It had said, thank you. Director Orath made the decision herself in the end, because committees rarely make decisions when the alternative is doing nothing, and doing nothing had started to feel worse than any available option. She granted docking clearance. She assigned Bay 14, the largest bay on the station, the one typically reserved for Cathali bulk freighters. She sent a reply in unified Galactic script. She also, quietly and without making any announcement, put every security team on the station on full alert, sealed the civilian residential levels, and sent an emergency burst transmission to the Assembly's Central Council, 7 light hours away, informing them that first contact with the Terran Coalition was either already happening or was about to happen, and that by the time they received this message, it would probably be over one way or another. I stood at the observation window on level 7 and watched Bay 14's exterior approach lights come on. I watched the docking arms extend, and then I watched the shuttle come in, a small vessel detaching from the side of that enormous ship like a single breath leaving a body, gliding toward us smoothly, without any of the usual communication chatter that pilots always filled the approach channels with. The shuttle was clean and silver-white and built in lines that were nothing like the rounded organic shapes of Thovani craft, or the angular aggressive geometry of Cathali military vessels. It had an almost simple look to it, the look of something designed by people who had long since stopped needing to prove anything with their engineering. It docked perfectly on the first attempt. I do not know exactly what I expected when the bay doors opened and the human envoy walked through. I had, in the 4 hours since the initial sensor alert, cycled through about a dozen different expectations, informed by 80 years of fragmentary observation data, traveler stories of uncertain reliability, and the deeply unhelpful tendency of my own imagination to fill gaps with the most dramatic available option. What walked into Bay 14 was a single human male, of average height by the data records we had, with short dark hair and an easy, relaxed posture. He was wearing a plain dark uniform with a small emblem on the chest that matched the Terran Coalition designation from the sensor readout. He was carrying nothing. He looked around the bay the way you look around a new room you find interesting but not alarming, taking in the ceiling height and the docking machinery with calm, steady eyes. Director Orath was there to meet him with a security escort of 12 officers. The human looked at the 12 officers, and then he looked at Director Orath, and he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a diplomatic smile. The kind of smile that meant he had expected exactly this, and found it reasonable. He said, in unified Galactic script, spoken with a noticeable but understandable accent, Director Orath, thank you for the clearance. My name is Aaron Hale. I am authorized to speak for the Terran Coalition. Behind him, through the bay's exterior windows, his ship floated in silence. It had not moved. It had not powered anything up. It was simply there, the way a mountain is simply there, and it was waiting, and the waiting felt like the most patient thing I had ever witnessed. I pressed my hand against the cold observation glass and stared at it, and for the first time since the alert had gone off, I understood what I was actually feeling. It was not fear of what the humans might do. It was something much stranger and, in some ways, much harder to manage. It was the fear of realizing that something vast and entirely new had just introduced itself to us, and that introduction had been so calm, so completely unhurried, that the truly terrifying part was not the ship outside, or the weapons on it, or the power readings that broke our sensors. The terrifying part was that Aaron Hale had said thank you, and he had meant it, and he had no reason not to. Aaron Hale spent his first 2 hours on the station in Bay 14's reception chamber, which was a room designed for exactly this kind of meeting. Neutral walls in a pale gray that no species found particularly offensive, seating adapted for a dozen different body types, temperature and atmospheric controls that could be adjusted to suit almost any biology. It was a comfortable room. It was also a room with 7 hidden sensor arrays, 3 concealed security access points, and a panic lockdown system that Director Orath could activate from her personal communicator in less than 4 seconds. None of that seemed to affect Aaron Hale in the slightest. He sat in one of the chairs with the loose, natural posture of someone who had simply chosen to sit down, rather than the rigid, formal posture most high-ranking diplomatic envoys adopted when they knew they were being watched and measured. He accepted a drink of water, checked briefly that it was water by looking at it, and then drank it without any of the elaborate tasting protocols that Velhari dignitaries required, or the chemical scan that Cathali officials always ran before consuming anything off their own ships. Director Orath sat across from him with her full protocol team, 2 senior translators, a behavioral specialist, a legal advisor, and an aide who was there specifically to take notes. I was not in that room. I was in the secondary observation corridor behind the wall, along with about 14 other junior and mid-rank staff, who had found reasons to be in that section of the station, and had quietly gathered at the observation glass, without anyone officially acknowledging that we were there. The first question Director Orath asked was the obvious one. She had clearly decided not to spend time on pleasantries, which I respected, because she was a practical being. She asked Aaron Hale what the Terran Coalition wanted. He considered the question for a moment, not in the way politicians consider questions when they are choosing which version of an answer to give, more in the way a person considers a question when they find it genuinely interesting. He said that the Terran Coalition wanted to introduce itself properly, because 80 years of silence had probably created some uncertainty, and the Coalition felt that uncertainty was not a good foundation for what they hoped would be a long relationship with the Galactic Assembly. Director Orath asked him what had happened during those 80 years. He said, quite simply, that humanity had been busy. There was a pause after that answer. Director Orath's behavioral specialist later filed a report noting that the pause had lasted 11 seconds, which was unusual because Director Orath never paused for 11 seconds. She paused for 11 seconds because she was processing the specific way Aaron Hale had said those 4 words, which was without any detectable irony, without any edge of boasting, and without any apparent awareness that "we were busy" was not a conventional answer to explain 8 decades of complete radio silence from your entire civilization. He added, after a moment, that they had been developing some things they wanted to understand properly before bringing them into contact with the broader galactic community. One of the translators leaned forward slightly. The behavioral specialist wrote something in her notes. Director Orath asked what kinds of things. Aaron Hale reached into his uniform pocket and placed a small device on the table between them. It was approximately the size of a closed fist, smooth, and a deep dark blue that seemed to absorb the room's light rather than reflect it. He did not explain it immediately. He simply set it on the table, folded his hands, and waited. The senior translator later confirmed that every single sensor array in the room had gone briefly offline for approximately 2 seconds when that device touched the table. They had come back online without any apparent damage. The device was still sitting there, doing nothing visible, when the sensors resumed. Aaron Hale said the device was not a demonstration of anything. He said it was a communication tool, and that he had set it on the table because keeping it in his pocket during a diplomatic meeting felt rude. He said that if anyone wanted him to put it away, he would. Nobody told him to put it away, mostly because nobody moved. I watched all of this from the observation corridor, standing between Quell, who had followed me from the observation platform and had not yet fully recovered his composure, and a Velhari cartographer named CL, who had no official reason to be in this corridor at all, but had gotten there first, and was pressed so close to the glass that her breath was fogging it. What happened next was the thing that spread through the station faster than any official report. Aaron Hale spent the following 3 hours answering Director Orath's questions. He answered them all. Every one. He did not deflect, did not redirect, did not offer the careful non-answers that every diplomat in the known galaxy used as standard tools of the trade. He answered questions about the coalition's population. He answered questions about their territorial boundaries, which were larger than the preliminary sensor surveys had suggested, and significantly larger than anyone in that room had privately estimated. He answered questions about their technology development timeline, which he summarized in broad strokes that were still specific enough to make the behavioral specialist stop writing and simply stare. He explained, in calm and simple language, that the coalition had chosen not to use radio communication for roughly 60 of the past 80 years, not because they had lost the capability, but because they had developed communication systems that did not rely on radio frequencies, and those systems were simply more efficient, and they had gradually transitioned to using them exclusively. He said this the way someone might explain that they had stopped using an older model of personal device after a better one became available. CL, beside me, made a soft sound. I glanced at her. She was doing math in her head. I could tell because Velhari have a specific expression when they are calculating, and do not like the answer they are arriving at. Her head was tilted slightly to the left, and her secondary eyelids were half closed. She finished her calculation and said, very quietly, without taking her eyes off Aaron Hale on the other side of the glass, that if what he was saying about their communication transition was accurate, then humanity had effectively become invisible to the rest of the galaxy, not because they were hiding, but because they had simply moved past the technology that the rest of the galaxy was using to look for them. The implications of that sat in the corridor like something with weight. The emergency session of department heads had broken up and reformed twice by midday. The problem was not that Aaron Hale was threatening anyone. The problem, which kept surfacing in different forms every time someone tried to propose a response framework, was that he was not threatening anyone, and the absence of any threat from a vessel with that sensor profile was somehow more disorienting than a direct threat would have been. Senior Security Coordinator Bren, a heavyset Cathali, with 30 years of station security experience, had spent 20 minutes in the emergency session arguing that the vessel outside represented a potential hostile force and that the station should have immediately requested military backup from the Assembly's nearest patrol fleet. 2 of the Velhari senior diplomats had argued back that requesting military backup against a vessel that had approached peacefully, followed standard docking protocol, and sent a single unarmed envoy who answered every question he was asked, would be both diplomatically disastrous and practically useless, given that the patrol fleet's entire firepower combined would not have made a meaningful impression on something that size. That argument had not made Coordinator Bren feel better. It had also not made anyone else feel better. It had just been true, which was its own particular kind of uncomfortable. The session eventually produced a working document describing the situation as a first contact event of the highest priority, recommending immediate escalation to the full Assembly Council, and noting that the Terran Coalition envoy had not yet made any specific requests or proposals. That last point was underlined. Everyone in the session had noticed it. Aaron Hale had answered every question, shared information freely, and had not yet asked for a single thing in return. No trade concession, no territorial recognition, no security agreement, no alliance structure preliminary outline. He had just come to introduce himself. That, more than anything else, was what was driving the station toward a particular kind of quiet, building tension that I had never felt before in 3 years of assembly work. Every species that had ever sent a diplomatic mission to this station had arrived with something they wanted. It was the foundational assumption of all galactic diplomacy. Everyone arrives wanting something, and the work of the assembly is to negotiate the shape of that something into a form that as many parties as possible can live with. It was not cynicism. It was just the operating reality of interstellar relations, and it had worked, more or less, for 400 years. Aaron Hale had arrived wanting, apparently, to say hello. By the time the afternoon session in the reception chamber concluded, and Aaron Hale was escorted to guest quarters on level 4, the station had divided itself, without anyone officially announcing the division, into 2 broad camps. There were those who were beginning to feel, cautiously and with many reservations, that humanity's arrival might actually be exactly what it appeared to be, and that this might be genuinely good. And there were those who were convinced, with a certainty that went beyond evidence and into something more like instinct, that nothing this large ever showed up at your door just to be friendly, and that the thing they were not seeing yet was the most important thing in the room. I went back to my assigned quarters that night, and sat on the edge of my sleeping platform for a long time, thinking about the way Aaron Hale had looked around Bay 14 when he first walked through the door. The calm eyes, the easy posture, the complete absence of any sign that he felt he was somewhere he should be careful. Not because he was not paying attention. He had clearly been paying close attention to everything. But the attention had the quality of interest, rather than the quality of calculation. He was curious. He was looking at us the way you look at something you genuinely want to understand. Outside the station, in the dark of Sector 11 space, TC Dreadnought 7 floated without moving. No lights except the standard navigation markers. No active weapon signatures. No communication traffic on any frequency we could detect. It was waiting. It was extraordinarily patient. And it had been there for less than 12 hours. And already the station felt like a different place than it had been when I woke up that morning, though I would not have been able to explain, in precise terms, exactly what had changed. What I knew was this: Aaron Hale would be sitting down with Director Orath again in the morning, and the closed-door sessions that the senior staff had been discussing would begin, and at some point, the question everyone was dancing around would finally have to be asked directly. Not what does the Terran Coalition want? He had already answered that, and the answer had been too simple to fully believe. The question was different, and it had been forming in the back of my mind since the moment Quell had made that sound at his console. Since the moment the mass reading had broken our sensor scale, since the moment a single man with calm eyes had walked off a ship the size of a small moon and said thank you for the docking clearance. The question was, if humanity had spent 80 years being busy, and this was what busy looked like, then what exactly had they built? And why, after all of it, had they decided that now was the time to come and say hello? The closed-door sessions began on the second morning, and I was not invited to any of them. What I knew about what happened inside those rooms came to me in pieces. A fragment from Quell, who had been pulled in as a sensor technical consultant. A detail from Ciel, who had somehow gotten herself attached to the Velhari diplomatic observer team. And a longer account from a mid-rank Cathali administrative officer named Dora, who had access to the session transcripts in her official capacity, and who, for reasons that probably had more to do with her own need to process what she was reading than with any deliberate decision to share information, told me most of what she knew over a meal in the Level 3 Commons that neither of us ate very much of. What Aaron Hale told the closed session, in the measured and entirely undefensive way he seemed to communicate everything, was this: the vessel outside was not the largest class of ship the Terran Coalition had in operation. It was not their most advanced design. It was not their flagship. It was, in the Coalition's internal classification system, a mid-range long-haul vessel, selected for this particular mission because its configuration was well suited for extended travel, and because it had comfortable accommodations for extended diplomatic stays. Dora told me this detail with the kind of flat, expressionless delivery that usually means a person has already done all the reacting they have available and is now simply reporting. The room had gone quiet when Aaron Hale said it. Director Orath had asked him to clarify, because clarification was what you asked for, when you had heard something correctly the first time, but needed a moment to absorb it. He had clarified, without any change in tone, that yes, the Coalition operated vessels of considerably larger scale than the one currently docked at the station, and that those vessels were primarily used for different purposes, and that he would be happy to share general specifications if the Assembly found that information useful. The behavioral specialist who had filed the report after the first day had, according to Dora, simply stopped taking notes at this point, and sat with her hands folded on the table, looking at Aaron Hale, with an expression Dora described as a being who has just realized the map they have been using is of an entirely different territory than the one they are standing in. The session moved on. Aaron Hale had answered follow-up questions about Coalition territorial space, confirmed that humanity had established permanent habitation on multiple planetary systems beyond Sol, described those systems in general geographic terms without specific coordinates, and then, when asked directly whether the coalition considered the Galactic Assembly's territorial definitions to apply to those systems, had paused for a moment and said, very carefully, that the coalition considered that question to be one of the things they were here to discuss. That was the first moment, Dora said, where Aaron Hale sounded like a diplomat. Not because he was being evasive, but because the careful phrasing of that answer acknowledged, for the first time, that there was something to negotiate, some area where interests were not automatically aligned, some space where the outcome was not yet decided. Everything before that had felt like information sharing. That answer felt like the beginning of something else. Director Oreth had called a recess after that exchange. 40 minutes. When the session resumed, she had added 2 more senior legal advisors to the assembly side of the table, and the tone of the room, by every account I received, had shifted from astonished and cautious to cautiously professional, which was, for the assembly, the functional equivalent of settling into battle readiness. Aaron Hale had noticed the change. He had not reacted to it in any visible way, but he had noticed it, because he was clearly someone who noticed things. He had also, reportedly, asked if he could have another glass of water, which the aide had provided, and which he had drunk without any apparent awareness that the request had briefly derailed every train of thought in the room. Outside the closed sessions, the station was doing what large communities always do when something unprecedented happens, and official information is moving slowly. It was generating its own information to fill the gap. Rumor, analysis, speculation, and second-hand account had layered on top of each other, until the truth was somewhere inside the mixture, but not easily separable from the rest of it. By the middle of the second day, I had heard 4 separate versions of what Aaron Hale had said in the first session, ranging from a fairly accurate account to one version in which he had apparently announced that the Terran coalition intended to claim the entire outer arm of the galaxy. I had heard the ship outside referred to as a peacekeeping vessel by one group, and as an obvious show of force by another group, standing 10 feet away in the same corridor, and both groups had been speaking with equal conviction. What I personally believed, based on what Dora had told me and what I had observed for myself in Bay 14, was something simpler and harder to categorize than either of those descriptions. I believed that Aaron Hale had told the truth in every single thing he had said, and that the truth was large enough that the Assembly's systems for processing and responding to new information were simply not built for it. It was not that the information was being hidden or distorted. It was that the information was genuinely outside the range of what anyone on this station had been trained to handle, and the response to that was a kind of collective cognitive overload that expressed itself as rumor and argument and the growing fracture lines I had been watching develop between different species groups for the past 36 hours. The Velhari senior diplomats had held 2 private meetings that were not on the official schedule. I knew this because CL had attended the second one and had come to find me afterward in the Commons, with the particular focused energy of someone who has information they need to share with another person, simply to confirm that it is real. She told me the Velhari position was evolving rapidly, and that the current direction of that evolution was toward early and direct engagement with the coalition, on the basis that the Velhari Exploration Cooperative and humanity shared certain apparent values around discovery and expansion, and that positioning the cooperative as an early partner in whatever relationship developed between the coalition and the assembly would be strategically significant. She said this and then looked at me as if waiting for me to tell her whether that logic sounded right. I said it sounded like the Velhari were moving fast. She said the Velhari were moving fast because they were afraid that if they did not move fast, the Kethali would, and the Kethali getting there first would be much worse, from the Velhari perspective, than the Velhari getting there first from the Kethali perspective. I asked her how she knew the Kethali were considering moving toward the coalition. She said that everyone was considering moving toward the coalition, and that the real question was not whether, but in what order, and on what terms, and that the species who figured out the order first, and moved accordingly, would be in a very different position than the species who waited. I thought about that for a while after she left. Then I went back to the observation platform, because the observation platform had become, for me, the place I went when I needed to think, and what I needed to look at while thinking was the ship outside. It had not moved. It had been there for 38 hours, and it had not moved, and it had not communicated anything beyond Aaron Hale's initial approach message. Its navigation lights cycled in the standard pattern. Its power readings were stable. It was simply there, enormous, and patient, and completely still. I thought about what Aaron Hale had said in the closed session, the detail that had traveled through 4 layers of account to reach me, but that I believed was essentially accurate, that this was not their largest class of ship. I thought about humanity being busy for 80 years. I thought about a species that had gone from radio signals to a communication technology our sensors could not detect in 60 years. I thought about the calm in Aaron Hale's eyes when he had looked at 12 security officers in Bay 14 and found the situation entirely reasonable. And then I thought about the question that had been forming in my mind since the first day, the one I had been carrying around and examining from different angles, the way you examine an object you cannot immediately identify. If humanity had built all of this in 80 years, while the rest of the galaxy was not watching, what did that mean about the next 80 years? What did it mean about the relationship between the Galactic Assembly, 400 years old, and built on assumptions of rough technological parity between its members, and a species that had spent 8 decades catching up and then kept going past the point where the race had any other participants? And what did it mean that they had come here, to our station, in one ship, with one person, and that person had said thank you for the docking clearance, and asked for a glass of water, and answered every question put to him, without ever once raising his voice or implying a threat? The most unsettling thing about a being who is genuinely confident is that they have no need to perform confidence. They do not make their size known. They do not remind you of their capabilities. They do not need to. The capability is simply there, behind every quiet word and patient answer, the way deep water is simply deep, whether or not it is moving on the surface. Aaron Hale had been here for less than 2 days, and without doing anything other than answering questions and drinking water, he had already accomplished something that no diplomatic envoy in the history of the Assembly had managed to do. He had made every species on this station look at every other species on this station and wonder whether the relationships they had carefully maintained for generations were built on a set of assumptions that no longer applied. That night, the first closed session between the Velhari observer team and the Cathali diplomatic mission took place without any official announcement. It lasted 3 hours. Neither party disclosed what was discussed. The Thovani senior representative requested a private communication channel to their home system that bypassed the station's standard relay. The Sulhari cooperative, my own people, sent a high-priority message to our home council that I was not authorized to read, but whose priority classification told me everything I needed to know about its content. The Assembly had spent 400 years as the structure that held the space between the stars together. It had done that job, mostly, through the slow and careful management of competing interests, through compromise and protocol, and the mutual understanding that the alternative to agreement was chaos, and nobody wanted chaos. Now, in the space of 2 days, a single ship had arrived and said hello, and the careful structure was beginning to show, in very quiet and very polite ways, just how fragile its foundations actually were, not because anyone had been threatened, not because anyone had been harmed, but because the map had changed, and everyone could feel it changing, and they were all trying to get to the best position on the new map before anyone else got there first. Aaron Hale slept in his guest quarters on level 4, apparently without any difficulty. His ship sat outside in the dark and waited, and the waiting was the most patient thing I had ever witnessed, and I was beginning to understand that this was not an accident. On the 3rd morning, the fractures that had been developing quietly beneath the surface of assembly operations finally reached the point where they were no longer quiet. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way most significant things happen in diplomatic environments, through a sequence of smaller decisions, each one individually defensible, which together produced a situation that no one had explicitly chosen, and that everyone, in retrospect, would claim they had been trying to prevent. The first event was the Velhari observer team formally requesting, through official channels, a bilateral meeting with Aaron Hale, separate from the joint assembly sessions. The request was procedurally unusual, but not technically prohibited. Director Orath denied it, citing the need to maintain consistent information access across all assembly members during an active first contact event. The Velhari representative, a senior diplomat named Fair who had been in assembly service for 40 years and who was not accustomed to being told no, filed a formal objection within the hour. The objection went into the assembly's records and immediately became the most read document on the station's internal network, because everyone who accessed the internal network that morning was specifically looking for signs of exactly this kind of thing. The second event followed within 2 hours. Senior Security Coordinator Bren submitted a formal request to Director Orath, proposing that the station initiate contact with the Assembly's nearest patrol fleet as a precautionary measure, citing the size of the docked vessel and the lack of full disclosure regarding coalition military capabilities. The request was carefully worded to frame the patrol fleet contact as a routine precaution, rather than a defensive mobilization. It was also, as anyone who read it carefully would notice, the third time Bren had submitted essentially this same request in 3 days, each version slightly more urgently worded than the last. Director Orath put the request under review. She did not approve it or deny it. Putting something under review was what you did in the assembly when you needed to make a decision, but the decision had costs, either way, and you were not yet certain which cost was smaller. Bren went back to his office, and the request sat in review, and the tension that had been building since the first day tightened another degree. I found out about both of these events from Dora, who was my best source of official information, and about the third event from Quell, who had the advantage of spending his working hours watching sensor data and therefore knew things that did not travel through the diplomatic communication channels. The third event was that 2 Cathali vessels had appeared at the edge of the sector. Military configuration, standard patrol weight. They were not within assembly neutral space jurisdiction. They had not requested communication with the station. They were simply there, at the outer limit of sensor range, doing what was technically within their rights as a sovereign fleet. Quell had been watching them for 4 hours before he told me. I asked him why he had waited 4 hours. He said he had been deciding whether telling me was the right thing to do, and he had decided it was, because I was someone who seemed to be paying attention to the larger shape of what was happening, and the larger shape had just added a new feature that he thought deserved to be seen by someone paying that kind of attention. The Cathali vessels were not a threat to the station. They were also not nothing. They were a message, written in the language of strategic positioning, and what they said was, "We are watching, we are close, and we have not yet decided what we think about this." That message had been sent not to the assembly station and not to Aaron Hale, but to the Velhari. Everyone with any experience reading this kind of communication would understand it that way. The Velhari had moved toward an independent approach to the coalition. The Cathali had moved their ships to the edge of the sector. The conversation being conducted between those two facts was not being conducted in any official session, and nothing about it would appear in any formal record. But it was the most significant conversation happening in the sector at that moment, and it was happening entirely around the edges of Aaron Hale and his ship and the assembly meetings, as if humanity had become a fixed point in space around which the existing order was beginning to rearrange itself. I went to find CL. She was in the Velhari section of the diplomatic residential level, in a small meeting room with 3 other members of the observer team, all of whom stopped talking when I walked in. I told CL about the Cathali vessels. She already knew. She had known for 2 hours. She asked me what I was going to do with the information. I told her I was trying to understand what was happening. She said that what was happening was that everyone on the station had spent the past 3 days focusing very intensely on the humans sitting in the meeting rooms downstairs and the human ship parked outside, and in doing so had possibly not paid enough attention to what the rest of the station was doing in response to those things. She said that Aaron Hale was not causing the fractures appearing in the assembly. He was simply the thing that the fractures had appeared around, the way a crack in a surface appears around the point of stress, not at it. I thought about that for the rest of the day. The afternoon joint session with Aaron Hale moved into its first substantive area of disagreement, which had been, by general understanding, inevitable from the moment he had said that territorial recognition was something they were here to discuss. The disagreement was not between Aaron Hale and the Assembly. It was between the Assembly members themselves. The Velhari position was that systems humanity had settled and developed independently of any prior galactic territorial claim were, under a reasonable reading of existing Assembly law, humanity's sovereign territory, and that the Assembly's role was to recognize that reality rather than negotiate it. The Cathali position, delivered with a controlled forcefulness that made the room uncomfortable, was that the entire question of coalition territorial claims needed to be evaluated within the existing assembly framework for territorial expansion, which required disclosure of specific coordinates and survey documentation and a formal review process that took a minimum of 2 standard years. The Thovani delegate said nothing during this exchange, which was itself a statement, because the Thovani never said nothing. Aaron Hale sat between both positions and watched the argument develop with the patient interest of a person observing a process they had expected. When the direct question was finally put to him, which territory specifically did the coalition consider sovereign, he said he would provide the assembly with a full geographic disclosure within 72 hours, and that the disclosure would be comprehensive. Then he said something that stilled the room in a way none of the previous tension had. He said the coalition had no interest in claiming territory already settled or actively used by assembly member species. He said the systems they had developed were, in every case, uninhabited at the time of settlement. He said the coalition was not here to displace anyone. What he did not say, but what every being in that room heard in the space around those words, was the other side of that statement. The systems the coalition had settled were uninhabited. The coalition was not going to displace anyone. But the coalition had settled multiple systems, plural, over 8 decades, and the scale of a civilization that had built a mid-range diplomatic vessel the size of a small moon could be, if anyone chose to do the math, extrapolated into a territorial footprint that made the existing assembly framework look like it had been drawn with insufficient paper. Nobody did the math out loud, but several people were doing it quietly. I was standing in the secondary observation corridor again, watching through the glass. Aaron Hale's face was calm. It was always calm, not the artificial calm of someone maintaining control over what they were actually feeling, but the genuine calm of someone who was not alarmed, who had thought carefully about what he was walking into, and had made his peace with the variables before he ever set foot on this station. That night, 3 more back-channel meetings took place between assembly member species that were not on any official schedule. The Thovani finally broke their silence and met privately with the Cathali for 90 minutes. The Sulhari cooperative representative, a senior diplomat named Veth who had arrived on the station that afternoon on an emergency transit from the relay point, met with 2 members of the Velhari observer team in a commons-level room that had been booked under the cover designation of a routine social gathering. I was not at any of these meetings, but I knew about all of them by the following morning, because a station with 4,000 beings and a very finite number of private meeting spaces is not actually capable of keeping secrets from itself for long, and because the species on this station had spent 3 days in an unprecedented situation and were deeply in need of talking to each other about it, even when the talking had to be unofficial. What I understood, by the 4th morning, was that Aaron Hale had come to introduce the Terran Coalition to the Galactic Assembly, and he had done so with perfect honesty and no visible agenda beyond what he had stated. And the result of that honest introduction was that the Assembly was now engaged in a level of internal political maneuvering that I had not seen in 3 years of working here, and the maneuvering was accelerating. Every species on the station was trying to answer the same question, in the specific terms of their own interests and concerns. Where do we stand in a galaxy that now includes humanity at full visibility? Some of them were moving toward the coalition, calculating that early partnership would be protective and beneficial. Some of them were moving toward each other, calculating that collective positioning within the existing assembly framework was the only counterweight to a civilization that had arrived with this much quiet capability. Some were trying to do both at once, which was the most politically complex position, and also the one most likely to satisfy nobody. Through all of it, Aaron Hale continued to sit in his meetings, answer his questions, drink his water, and sleep without apparent difficulty in his level 4 quarters. His ship sat outside and did not move. The patience of it was, by this point, beginning to feel like its own kind of weight. The patience was not passive. It was not the patience of something waiting to see what would happen. It was the patience of something that had already decided what it was going to do, and had simply arranged itself comfortably to wait for the right moment, the way deep water waits behind a dam, not because it has nowhere to go, but because the time to move has not yet come. Coordinator Bren's request to contact the patrol fleet was still under review. The Cathali vessels at the edge of sensor range had been joined by a third, and I went to the observation platform again that evening and looked at the ship in the dark. and I thought that if I could see it clearly enough, if I could hold the full shape of it in my mind all at once, instead of just the parts of it that fit inside my understanding, I might be able to see something in it that would tell me what came next. But it was too large to see all at once. That was the thing about it. You could never see all of it at the same time. You always had to look at one part and understand that the rest existed in the dark beyond your field of vision, patient and enormous and entirely real. On the 5th day, Aaron Hale did something no one expected. He asked for a break from the formal sessions and requested permission to walk the station freely, with Director Orath's approval, as a way of seeing how the assembly actually worked at ground level, rather than in meeting rooms. He framed it as a genuine interest in understanding the community, before continuing the policy discussions. Director Orath agreed, because refusing would have implied either fear or distrust, and the Assembly's position had been, officially, that they were approaching this first contact event with openness and professional courtesy. She assigned a discreet escort of 2 officers, and did not announce the arrangement to the wider station population. The announcement happened anyway, because it always does. I saw Aaron Hale in the Level 3 Commons at roughly midday on the 5th day. He was sitting at a table near the outer window, looking at the view, which included a clear line of sight to his own ship, docked at Bay 14. He had a meal tray in front of him, station-issue food that the Commons dispensed automatically to any being without a registered dietary profile, which in practice meant a generic nutrient-balanced combination that nobody found delicious but everyone found acceptable. He was eating it with the same equable calm he brought to everything else. The Commons was unusually full for midday. I do not think this was a coincidence. I think a large number of beings on the station had found very convincing reasons to take their midday meal at exactly that time, in that location, because they wanted to see what Aaron Hale looked like when he was not in a formal session. What he looked like was a person having lunch. He made no special effort to engage with anyone, but he also did not appear to be avoiding anyone. When a young Thovani maintenance technician stopped near his table and stared, with the direct and uncomplicated curiosity of someone who had not yet learned that staring was considered rude in cross-species social contexts, Aaron Hale looked up and smiled and said something in unified Galactic script that the technician laughed at. Not a polite or uncertain laugh, a genuine one. I walked over after a moment, because I had been watching from the doorway long enough to feel that I was the one behaving oddly, and also because everything in my nature, as a diplomatic professional, and as a person, wanted to understand him, and he was right there. I introduced myself. I said my name and my rank and my home cooperative, because that was protocol, and then I immediately felt that protocol was slightly absurd in this context, and that he probably knew it too. He said his name, which I already knew, and he said it was good to meet me, and he gestured at the seat across from him in a way that asked without pressuring. I sat down. What followed was the most unusual conversation I had in that entire week, and that is saying something significant given the week I had had. He asked me about the Sulhari Cooperative, not diplomatically, not as a data-gathering exercise, but with the specific interest of someone who genuinely did not know much about it, and found that interesting, rather than embarrassing. He asked about our home system, about our history with the assembly, about what my work as an attaché actually involved day to day. I answered, and somewhere in answering I found myself asking questions back, which was not what I had planned, but which felt natural in a way the formal session dynamic had not. I asked him how long he had been doing this first contact work. He said he had been with the Coalition's diplomatic service for 11 years. I asked how many first contact events he had participated in. He said this was his first. I said that the Coalition had made first contact with other species before humanity's arrival here. Everyone knew the rumors. The species near the outer arm that had gone dark after an encounter with something that fit certain parameters. He nodded. He said those encounters had been different, earlier, less formal. He said the Coalition had learned from them, and that what they had learned was that the first formal introduction needed to be approached with patience and care, because first impressions were very hard to correct once they were established. I asked him if he was concerned about the impression that had been established. He thought about that for a moment. He looked out the window at his ship, sitting in Bay 14, enormous and still. He said no. He said he thought the assembly was doing exactly what a well-functioning organization should do when encountering a significant unknown, gathering information, assessing positions, having internal discussions that were probably somewhat difficult. He said that was healthy. He said he would be more concerned if the assembly had simply smiled and agreed to everything immediately, because that would suggest they were not taking it seriously. I asked him if the chaos the assembly was currently experiencing, and I used that word deliberately because by the 5th day it was an accurate description, bothered him. He looked at me for a moment, and in that moment I had the sense, which I had had several times watching him from the observation corridor, that he was being very honest in a way that also required him to be careful with the words he chose. He said that the chaos was not something humanity had caused. He said humanity had simply arrived, and the chaos was the assembly's existing internal tensions responding to something outside the normal range of their experience. He said he hoped those tensions would resolve in ways that left the assembly stronger rather than weaker. He also said, and he said it quietly, that the coalition was not going anywhere, and that the assembly would have time to reach whatever conclusions it needed to reach, and that patience was something the coalition had a great deal of, and they were prepared to use it for as long as necessary. I thought about that on my way back to the observation platform afterward. I thought about what patience meant at that scale. A civilization that had spent 80 years developing before making contact. A ship that had been parked outside for 5 days without any visible impatience. A diplomatic envoy who ate Station Commons food and made Thovani maintenance technicians laugh, and said the right things in the right tone without ever needing to remind anyone of what was sitting behind him in Bay 14. The final full joint session began on the afternoon of the 5th day. What emerged from it was not a resolution, because resolutions of this magnitude did not emerge in 5 days. What emerged was a framework outline for continued dialogue, a preliminary acknowledgement that the Terran Coalition was a recognized sovereign entity for purposes of assembly engagement, and an agreement on a schedule for a second formal contact, to take place at the Assembly Central Council location, 7 light hours away, within the next 30 standard days. It was, by the standards of assembly diplomacy, a significant result for 5 days of sessions. It was also, as Director Oreth noted in her private report, that I was not supposed to see but saw anyway, because Dora had remarkably poor document security practices, the beginning of a process that was going to reshape every relationship in the assembly in ways that nobody was yet able to fully predict. The final thing that happened on the 5th day happened in the evening, after the session closed and Aaron Hale had gone back to his quarters to prepare for departure the following morning. Coordinator Bren's request to contact the patrol fleet was finally answered. Director Orath denied it. The official reason given was that the first contact event had proceeded without incident, and the presence of a patrol fleet would complicate the diplomatic atmosphere for the next scheduled engagement. The unofficial reason, which was obvious to everyone who thought about it for more than a moment, was that Director Orath had spent 5 days watching the most carefully maintained diplomatic composure she had ever seen in practice, and she had reached a conclusion that Bren had not yet reached, which was that the option of a patrol fleet had never been a real option, and that proceeding as if it might have been would only make the assembly look as if it had not understood the situation from the start. The 3 Cathali vessels at the edge of sensor range departed that evening, without any communication to the station. Nobody announced their departure. Quell noted it quietly in the sensor log, and told me about it in the same quiet way he had told me about their arrival. I spent that night on the observation platform. I did not tell myself I was doing this for any professional reason. I simply wanted to be there. Aaron Hale's ship sat in Bay 14, and the navigation lights cycled in their patient pattern, and in the morning it would leave, and the galaxy would be different from the one that had existed 6 days ago, in every way that mattered. I was at the observation window in Bay 14 the next morning, when Aaron Hale's shuttle undocked. Not the large exterior window this time, the interior one, the small porthole-sized window set into the corridor wall at shoulder height, the one that gave a partial view of the bay floor and the edge of the shuttle's docking cradle. I had come very early, before anyone else was there, and I had stood at that window and waited. The shuttle lifted cleanly off the cradle, at 0700 station time, exactly when Aaron Hale had said it would. No delays, no last-minute communications, no dramatic pauses. It simply lifted, turned, and moved toward the exterior bay doors, which opened ahead of it, with the smooth mechanical precision of equipment that had been carefully maintained, and that had never, in the history of this station, opened for anything like this. I watched the shuttle clear the bay doors and move into open space, and then I watched it cross the distance to the large ship in the efficient, unhurried way it had covered everything else. And I watched it dock, a small white shape returning to the side of something enormous and still, and the docking clamps took hold, and the shuttle was gone, absorbed back into the vessel as if it had never left. There was a long pause, several minutes. The ship's navigation lights continued their cycle. Its drive systems were offline, the same as they had been since arrival. Then, very gradually, the readings on Quell's sensor console at the far end of the observation platform began to change. Drive signature activating, coming up slowly through the power stages the way a very large and very well-designed system comes to readiness, without rushing, without any of the sharp energy spikes that smaller and less sophisticated vessels produce during startup. Just a steady, methodical build of power, each system confirming operational status before the next engaged. Quell was watching his console. So were 3 other technicians who had arrived early that morning, with no announced reason for doing so. The observation platform had, over the past 6 days, become a place that beings drifted toward when they needed to feel that they were witnessing the shape of things, and this morning was no exception. The ship moved away from the station at a speed that seemed too slow for something that size, and then, as it cleared the minimum safe distance from the station, it began to accelerate, and the acceleration was nothing like what the size suggested it should be, and it kept building, and within 4 minutes it had reached a velocity that our sensors had to actively update their range to continue tracking, and within 6 minutes, it had crossed the entire width of Sector 11, and within 8 minutes, it had reached the FTL threshold, and then it was gone. Not with a flash. Not with a shockwave. Not with any of the theatrical energy effects that smaller FTL drives produced. It simply stopped being in the sector. One moment the sensor trace was there, moving very fast, and then the sensor trace was not there, and the space where it had been was empty and ordinary and unchanged. I stayed at the observation window for a while after that. The observation platform around me was quiet, not the tense, held breath quiet of the first day, when the ship had arrived and nobody knew what it meant. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes after something very large has ended, and the air is still carrying the shape of it even though the thing itself is gone. Director Orath had scheduled a full station debrief for that afternoon. The formal process of synthesizing 6 days of events into a coherent record and set of recommendations would take weeks. The session transcripts alone would run to a length that would require specialist review teams. The political fallout within the assembly from the fractures that had opened during the week was going to take months to fully map and address. The question of the territorial disclosure Aaron Hale had promised, the comprehensive geographic data package due within 72 hours of his departure, was going to open an entirely new chapter of analysis that the Assembly's existing frameworks were not equipped to handle quickly. There was an enormous amount of work ahead, and all of it would be conducted in the shadow of the understanding that had settled over the station in the past 6 days. That understanding being one that changed almost everything about how the next chapter of galactic history would need to be written. I thought about what CL had said, that Aaron Hale was not causing the fractures. He was simply the point around which they had appeared. I had been turning that observation over for days, and I still thought it was true, and I also thought it was incomplete. Because the fractures had appeared for a reason. The Assembly's internal tensions had been there before the ship arrived. The old competition between the Velhari and the Cathali, the Thovani's careful neutrality that served their own purposes, the smaller species like my own Sulhari cooperative, navigating the space between the larger powers, with the particular caution of those who cannot afford to be wrong about which direction to move. All of that had existed for decades. The Assembly's structure had managed it, mostly, by providing a shared framework that made the cost of the framework's collapse too high for any single member to bear. What Aaron Hale's arrival had done was not create those tensions. It had shown, with complete clarity, that the shared framework was built on an assumption that was no longer accurate. The assumption was that the species in this assembly were, broadly speaking, in comparable positions of capability, that the balance of power, though always shifting, was a real balance, and that everyone at the table had roughly similar stakes in maintaining it. That assumption was gone now. Not because humanity had said anything to challenge it, but because the existence of humanity, at the scale that had been quietly and patiently demonstrated over 6 days, changed the mathematics of every relationship in the assembly, simply by being real. The framework had been managing the competition between species who were all, more or less, in the same general league. Now there was a new variable, and the new variable was not in the same general league, and the framework was not designed for that, and everyone could feel the design failing even before any specific point of failure had been formally identified. This was not a problem that could be solved by calling a patrol fleet, or by one species securing an early bilateral relationship before others did, or by legal frameworks and territorial review processes. Those things would all happen, and they would be useful, and they would keep people occupied for a long time. But the underlying question, the one that the formal processes could not actually answer, was simpler and harder than any policy document. The question was, how you build a stable future when the stability you have been operating under turns out to have been a narrower thing than you understood, and when the new shape of the future belongs to someone who is enormously patient and does not need to explain themselves, but who has, as Aaron Hale said in the Level 3 Commons while eating station food, no interest in displacing anyone. I went back to my assigned quarters and sat at my desk. I had a report to write for the Sulhari Cooperative. It was overdue. I had been putting it off because I did not yet know how to begin, which was unusual for me, since writing was generally the part of my job I found the most straightforward. I started it now. I started it by saying that the Galactic Assembly had spent the past 6 days encountering something it had no category for, and that the thing it had encountered had introduced itself with perfect honesty and complete patience, and that the nightmare the Assembly's older records had sometimes used to describe first contact with an unknown advanced civilization was not, in the event, a nightmare at all. It was something more interesting and more difficult than that. It was an introduction. And introductions are the beginning of relationships, not the end of them. And the character of a relationship depends less on the power held by one party than on the intentions both parties bring to it. Aaron Hale had said thank you for the docking clearance. He had meant it. The coalition had arrived in one ship, with one person, and had answered every question, and had asked for nothing, and had been patient, in a way that the galaxy would need a long time to fully understand. The nightmare had never been the ship. The nightmare was the question the ship's existence forced everyone to ask, the one nobody had been prepared to answer. Now that we know you are here, what kind of neighbors are we going to be? That question had no quick answer. It was going to be answered slowly, in sessions and negotiations and bilateral meetings and careful positioning and, eventually, in the quieter and more permanent ways that civilizations answer questions about each other, by what they actually do over time, rather than what they say in any given room. But the question had been asked, and it had been asked by the simple fact of a ship arriving at our door and requesting docking clearance and saying thank you. And in the open door, that question had left behind, I could feel the future pulling through like air through a passage, cool and enormous and entirely new. I finished my report. I filed it. I went to the observation platform one more time, though there was nothing out there to observe now except the ordinary dark of Sector 11, empty and familiar and changed. I stood at the window for a while anyway. I was thinking about what it meant to introduce yourself to a galaxy and leave it, quietly and entirely, different, not by force, not by demand, by showing up, being honest, saying thank you, and then going home. Humanity had just introduced itself. The rest of us were going to need a very long time to decide what kind of introduction to give in return, and somewhere in the direction the ship had gone, beyond the sensor range of any instrument we had, across the distance between their home and ours, something was waiting with extraordinary patience for us to figure it out. I thought that was the most unsettling thing of all, not the patience that had been visible here, in the meeting rooms and the commons and the Bay 14 corridor, the patience we would never see, the patience of an entire civilization that had decided the moment was right to say hello, and had sent one ship and one man, and one glass of water, and 6 days of honest answers, and then gone quietly home to wait. Whatever came next, the galaxy would not be the same as the one I had woken up in on the morning the alert went off. The ordinary business of the assembly, the trade disputes and the territorial reviews and the carefully managed competitions between species who all thought they understood the shape of the board they were playing on, all of that would continue, because it had to, because the practical work of maintaining the space between stars does not stop for revelation. But underneath it all, in every calculation and every negotiation and every position paper and every private meeting between species trying to figure out where they stood, there would be this: the knowledge that the map had changed, that there was something on the map now that had not been there before, something vast and patient and, as far as anyone could tell, genuinely well-intentioned. And the most honest thing I could say, as a junior diplomatic attaché, sitting at a desk on a station in Sector 11, trying to write a report that would help my home cooperative understand what had just happened, was that I did not know what came next. What I knew was that Aaron Hale had said the coalition was not going anywhere. What I knew was that the open door they had left behind was real. What I knew was that somewhere out there, across the dark, a civilization had spent 80 years being busy, and had arrived to say hello, and had said it so quietly and so patiently that the echo of it was still moving through the station, like sound through deep water. And what I felt, sitting at my desk with my filed report and the empty observation platform at the end of the hall, was not fear, it was not relief. It was something older and stranger than either of those things. It was the feeling you get when you realize the world is much larger than the edges you could see from where you were standing, and that the largeness is real, and that you are now going to have to live in it. The alert that had changed everything had come without warning, on an ordinary day, while the assembly handled trade disputes and the usual bureaucratic routine. It had come as a sensor reading, a mass figure that did not fit the scale of anything we had words for, and a message in clean Galactic script that said thank you and asked for a bay assignment. 6 days later, the ship was gone. The man was gone. The bay was empty. The ordinary dark of Sector 11 looked exactly the same as it had looked before any of it began. The galaxy, though, was not the same, and neither was I. And that, I wrote at the bottom of my report, with the careful understatement of someone who had spent 6 days watching history from a window, was probably the point.